After a storm in Botswana, a premature baby elephant was left behind in the cold mud by his own mother while the herd disappeared over the horizon. He was far too small to survive alone, yet he kept calling out with the last strength he had. Then, a young boy heard him. A rescue began. But what no one expected was that the real fight would not just be to save his life. It would be to heal the heart of a baby who had been abandoned on the very first day of his life. By the time the storm finally moved east, the grasslands of northern Botswana looked bruised and half-drowned. Shallow water gleamed in the low places, and the earth had turned to a dark, sucking paste under every hoofprint. A herd of elephants emerged from the thinning rain like shadows made solid, silent, except for the heavy rhythm of their feet. They moved the way wild herds always had, with the older females in front and the younger bodies folded safely inside the living wall of them. Steam lifted from their backs in the cold morning air. Mud clung to their legs. The storm had passed, but urgency still hung over the group, pressing them onward toward higher, drier ground. A few yards behind them, nearly hidden in the flattened reeds, something small struggled to stand. He was new enough to the world that his skin still looked too large for him, wrinkled and loose over a body that had not finished growing. His legs shook with every effort. When he pushed himself upright, the mud pulled at him as if it meant to keep him there. His mother stood over him for one long, terrible moment. Rain slid from her tusks. She lowered her trunk and touched his back, then his face, then the fragile curve of his side. To any human eye, it might have looked like hesitation. To the calf, it was the only warmth he knew. He leaned weakly toward her, not yet understanding that love could retreat. She turned before he found his balance. Not sharply, not cruelly, just with the blunt certainty of instinct. The herd responded at once, shifting around her and continuing forward through the soaked plain. The calf made a small sound and tried to follow, but one front foot slipped deep into the churned ground. By the time he freed it, the bodies ahead were already moving away. He called again, louder this time, a thin and broken cry that seemed too small for the open land around him. One of the younger females glanced back. Another slowed for half a step. Then the matriarch gave a low command the calf could not understand, and the line gathered itself and kept going. No one returned. No one circled back to stand beside him. The calf lurched after them anyway. He managed 3 clumsy steps before his hind legs folded under him. His chest hit the mud with a wet, helpless sound. He lay there stunned, ears twitching, trunk dragging across the waterlogged grass. Then he pushed himself up again, because the fading scent of the herd still lived in the air, and some newborn part of him believed it had to mean safety. The storm had left the world colder than it should have been. Water ran in narrow threads through the tracks the herd had made, blurring their path, stealing the only map he had. His body had none of the sturdy confidence a healthy calf was meant to have. He was too small, too early, too weak, and the plain around him offered no mercy for any of those things. He reached a shallow patch where the ground looked firm and sank almost to his knees. Panic flashed through him for the first time. He flailed, splashing muddy water over his face, and let out a cry so sharp it startled a pair of guinea fowl from the brush nearby. They burst into the air in a frantic blur, leaving him alone again with the sound of his own breathing. Somewhere far off, the herd answered the morning with a low, rolling rumble. It was faint, almost swallowed by wind, but the calf heard it. He lifted his head so fast he nearly toppled. For one aching second, hope moved through him like warmth. He called back with everything he had. The sound tore out of him, thin, high, and desperate. The distant rumble did not come again. So he stood in the wreckage of the storm, trembling under a sky that had begun to clear. Sunlight broke through in pale strips, touching the flooded grass and the wet folds of his skin, but it brought him no comfort. Every instinct in his body told him to stay near his mother, near the herd, near the living circle that should have closed around him. Instead, there was only distance. By late morning, the first flies had found him. They settled at the corners of his eyes and along the damp edges of his ears. He shook them off weakly, too tired to do more. Once, he bent his trunk toward the ground, as if searching for milk that might still be there, some trace of what had been taken from him. He found only mud, roots, and cold water dark as tea. A lone jackal appeared on a rise and watched him for several silent seconds before slipping away into the grass. The calf saw the movement and froze, every muscle tightening beneath his sagging skin. Nothing attacked, nothing approached, but the world had changed shape around him now. It was no longer a place held together by giant bodies and familiar sounds. It was open, empty, and far too large. When he called again, the sound was softer than before. It drifted over the soaked plain and disappeared into the brightening day. He stayed where he was because he had nowhere else to go. His small body shivering in the aftermath of rain, his eyes fixed on the broken trail the herd had left behind. Somewhere beyond that horizon, they were still moving. He was not. The rainwater had settled into the land by afternoon, filling the low ground with still, shallow pools that reflected a hard, white sky. The little calf remained where the herd had left him, though the world around him no longer felt like the same place. What had been a trail of bodies and sound that morning had thinned into silence, heat, and distance. He had stopped trying to follow the broken line of footprints. Every attempt cost too much. His legs trembled after only a few unsteady steps, and the mud seemed to remember him now, gripping at his ankles whenever he moved. So he stood, then sagged, then stood again, trapped between exhaustion and instinct, not yet old enough to understand what waiting meant. From time to time, he lifted his head and listened. The savannah carried noise in strange ways after rain. A bird call might sound near when it was far. Wind brushing through reeds might mimic movement. More than once, he thought he heard the low, body-deep rumble of elephants and answered with a cry so thin it hardly sounded like it belonged to him. Nothing answered back. The silence after each call grew heavier, as if the land itself were learning to ignore him. Flies gathered around his eyes. His trunk, still clumsy and uncertain, brushed weakly at his face and then dragged through wet grass. Once he pressed it against the ground, where his mother had stood, searching for something familiar in the smell of mud and rain. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last cool mercy the storm had left behind. Steam no longer rose from the earth. Now the soaked plain began to bake. Heat pressed into the calf's thin skin, and the dampness that had chilled him earlier turned sticky and uncomfortable. He shifted his weight without meaning to, then nearly collapsed when one front leg buckled under him. He caught himself just in time. For a long moment, he stayed frozen, chest heaving, eyes wide and glassy. If he went down again, getting back up might be harder this time. Something in him seemed to know that. He stood very still, ears hanging limp, while a trickle of muddy water slid past his feet and disappeared into a patch of flattened reeds. On a dry rise not far away, a small shape moved between the grasses. Then another, jackals this time, lean and watchful. Not bold enough to come close in daylight, but curious enough to linger. The calf saw them and let out a sound that was more breath than call. The jackals paused, studying him, then drifted off when he did not fall. By late afternoon, the sky had gone huge and pale, emptied of clouds and feeling. The calf's cries came less often now. Each one took longer to gather. Each one seemed to leave him smaller afterward. He no longer called because he expected his mother to return. He called because something inside him still reached toward her, even as the rest of him began to fail. Miles away, near the southern boundary of the reserve, Eli Turner rode in the passenger seat of his father's weather-beaten truck. The storm had knocked down part of the outer fence, and they had been sent out with wire, tools, and a thermos of coffee to inspect the damage. Eli's father drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes on the washed-out track ahead. Eli was the first to hear it. At first, he thought it was some kind of bird, caught low in the reeds. Then it came again, thin and rough and strangely human in its desperation. He turned in his seat, listening so hard he stopped breathing. "Did you hear that?" he asked. His father did not answer right away. He had heard it too. They cut the engine and sat in the sudden hush. There it was again, carried unevenly across the open ground. Not loud, not strong. Just a raw little sound pulled from somewhere close to the edge of life. Eli was out of the truck before his father could stop him, boots sinking into the soft earth as he moved toward the reeds. His father caught up fast and grabbed his arm. "Easy," he said, voice low and sharp. The reserve had taught him caution the hard way. A calf alone could mean a distressed mother nearby, or a herd just out of sight, or predators already circling and unwilling to give up what they considered theirs. They moved forward together after that, step by measured step. When they finally saw him, Eli stopped cold. The calf looked smaller than he had imagined from the sound alone, all angles and mud and trembling legs. Half his lower body was sunk in a patch of black, rain-softened ground. His ears were crusted with dirt. His eyes looked too large for his face, and when he lifted his head, it was with the slow, painful effort of something nearly emptied out. Eli took one step forward before his father held a hand across his chest. There were tracks everywhere, some blurred by rain, some fresh enough to read. The big round impressions of a herd heading north, smaller scavenger prints near the edge of a dry hump of land, and no return path, no circling mother, no sign that anything living had come back for him. The calf saw them then. For one suspended second, he did not seem frightened at all, just exhausted, beyond fear, beyond choice. He made a weak sound and tried to pull one leg free from the mud. He couldn't. Eli felt something in his chest twist hard enough to hurt. This was not an animal roaming loose. This was a baby that had been left where the world could finish the job. His father slowly reached for the radio clipped at his shoulder. He kept his eyes on the grasses while he spoke, scanning for movement, for danger, for anything the storm might have hidden. Eli stood beside him, unable to look away from the calf. Somewhere beyond the flooded plain, the day continued as if nothing had happened. But here, everything had changed. By the time Eli's father finished the first radio call, the light had started to soften at the edges, turning the flooded grass silver where the sun struck it. The calf still stood trapped in the same patch of black mud, his head lowered now, his narrow shoulders trembling with effort. Every few seconds, his trunk drifted down, as if even holding it up had become too much. The ranger station answered with questions first. How old did he look? Was the herd still nearby? Were there signs of injury? Signs of a mother circling back? Signs of predators moving in? Eli's father gave the facts in the plain voice of a man trained not to decorate bad news. Very young, no mother in sight, no return tracks, weak enough to lose the night. The calf watched them with a strange, fading attention, as if he were trying to decide what kind of creatures they were. He did not cry out again right away. That frightened Eli more than the earlier sounds had. A baby that exhausted had already crossed some invisible line. He was no longer calling for the herd because he believed they would answer. He was calling because he had nothing else left. A second vehicle arrived 20 minutes later, tires crunching over a strip of firmer ground near the reeds. 2 reserve officers stepped out with binoculars, field packs, and the wary posture of people who knew how quickly a quiet rescue could turn dangerous. One of them, a broad-shouldered woman named Ruth, studied the plane before she said a word. She knelt by a wash of footprints and pointed to the softened impressions in the mud. The herd had gone north, and not recently. The storm had blurred the oldest edges, but the fresher damage belonged to scavengers moving in and out through the day. Ruth didn't say what everyone was already thinking. If the calf was still alive by morning, it would only be because weakness had made him a poor target. Eli moved closer than the others when they let him. Not close enough to touch, not close enough to startle, but close enough to see the calf's eyes clearly. They were rimmed with mud and flies, dull with fatigue, yet still fixed on every human motion. When Eli shifted his weight, the calf tried to do the same, as if some last thread inside him still believed he might follow. The reserve officers debated what to do in low, clipped voices. Protocol mattered. A calf could not simply be lifted and taken without making every effort to assess whether intervention would do more harm than good. Sometimes a mother returned after hours. Sometimes a herd circled back at dusk. Sometimes what looked like abandonment was only distance. But this did not feel like distance. The calf's knees shook so violently now that each attempt to stand looked temporary. Twice he slipped deeper into the mud and had to fight his way back to the same miserable posture. His breathing had gone shallow and fast. The sunlight on his back no longer warmed him. It only showed how thin he was, how unfinished his little body seemed, as though he had arrived too early for his own life. Ruth made the second call herself. This one did not go to the local station. It went farther, across the reserve network, to a small wildlife recovery outpost near the southern edge, where difficult cases were sometimes sent when regular channels failed. Eli heard only half the conversation, but certain words cut through clearly. Premature calf, no herd response, critical dehydration, immediate transport, unlikely without specialist support. At the recovery outpost, Emily Morrison was rinsing medical syringes in a metal sink when the call came through. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, wet canvas, and the grain mash she had spent the afternoon preparing for an injured antelope in the next enclosure. Outside, Evening wind moved through the mopane trees, scraping branches softly against the tin roof over the storage shed. She listened without interrupting. The details assembled themselves in her mind with painful speed. Newborn. Alone since morning, maybe longer. Trapped in post-storm mud. Weak vocal response. Possible hypothermia beneath surface heat. She had once worked neonatal pediatric shifts in Colorado, and though this was no human child, her body recognized the pattern before her thoughts fully did. A baby was fading somewhere out there. When she stepped out onto the porch, Jack Morrison was tightening a loose strap on the back of the supply truck. He had spent half the day hauling fencing posts and feed sacks, and there was dust dried white along one sleeve. Emily did not need to say much. He saw something in her face and straightened at once. She told him there was a calf, alone after the storm. Jack listened in silence, one hand still resting on the strap. He had seen enough rescues go wrong to know that wanting to help and being able to help were not the same thing. The outpost was already crowded. A sable antelope with a shattered hind leg occupied the recovery pen. A juvenile baboon with a spinal injury needed monitoring every 3 hours. Supplies had been running thin for weeks. Then came the part that made the decision heavier. The reserve veterinarian, reached by satellite a few minutes later, advised caution. If the calf was as weak as reported, survival odds were poor. A full-scale field recovery in unstable mud could injure both rescuers and animal. If the mother had truly rejected him, they might be driving hard and fast into a loss they could not reverse. Emily stood in the open doorway while Jack took the call, her fingers wrapped around the frame so tightly her knuckles whitened. She did not argue with the veterinarian's facts. She understood them too well. But facts had their own cruelty. They could explain why a life might not be saved without ever touching the ache of leaving it there. When Jack lowered the phone, she finally spoke. "If he's still calling," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "then he's still waiting for somebody." The words settled over the yard and seemed to change the air. Jack looked past her into the dim room where shelves of bottles, blankets, and feed tubs lined the wall. Their house had no nursery, no child's room, no toys left scattered on a floor. It had been built around work, around endurance, around the private silence two people learn after enough disappointment. He turned back toward the truck and reached for the keys hanging from a hook by the door. He did not say yes in any grand way. He simply opened the passenger side, checked the fuel gauge, and started loading what they would need if the calf still had time left to be helped. Blankets, warm water jugs, rope, a field kit, oral fluids, tarps, hope, packed into practical things. As the engine came alive, the sky over the reserve deepened toward evening, and the first cool breath of night slipped across the ground. Far away, on a patch of storm-softened earth, the little calf remained where the herd had left him, too weak to understand that his small, breaking cries had finally reached beyond the silence. But the world had begun, at last, to move toward him. The drive out to the flooded grassland took longer than it should have. Storm damage had chewed up the track, and more than once, Jack had to slow the truck to ease through standing water that hid deep ruts beneath the surface. Emily sat forward in her seat the entire way, one hand braced on the dash, listening to the radio updates as if listening alone might keep the calf alive. By the time they arrived, the sun had lowered, enough to cast long bars of amber across the wet plain. Eli saw the truck first and ran toward it, relief breaking across his face before he even reached the door. His father followed more slowly, mud to the knees, his expression tight, with the kind of caution that comes when a situation has only grown worse with time. Emily stepped down before the engine fully settled. The smell hit her first. Wet earth, trampled reeds, standing water already beginning to sour in the heat. Then she saw him. The calf stood where they had described, though stood now felt too generous a word. He was propped on trembling legs, half sunken in black mud, his head hanging low enough that the tip of his trunk dragged through the surface. He was smaller than she had imagined. Smaller, thinner, newer. His skin still had that unfinished look some newborns carry, as if the world had received them before their bodies were fully ready. Mud crusted along his side and beneath his jaw. Flies gathered at the corners of his eyes. When he tried to lift his head toward the humans, the movement seemed to cost him nearly everything he had left. Jack did not go straight in. First he studied the ground, the softened edges of the sinkhole, the herd tracks pulling north, the scavenger prints skirting the margins. Ruth stood beside him and pointed out where the earth had given way most badly. If they rushed, one of them could go down waist deep. If the calf panicked, he might thrash and drive himself deeper. If darkness came first, the whole plain would belong to something else. The calf made a sound then, faint, cracked, barely more than air forced through a raw throat. Emily turned immediately. It was not a full cry anymore. It was the thin, exhausted noise of a baby too weak to call properly and too frightened to stop trying. She moved a little closer, slow enough not to startle him, and lowered herself until she was nearer to his eye level. "It's okay," she said softly, though she knew he could not understand the words. Tone mattered more than meaning in moments like this. Calm mattered. Presence mattered. The calf blinked through mud and flies and looked at her with a kind of stunned attention. He did not lunge or flinch. He just stared, as if somewhere inside the haze of pain, he had noticed that someone had finally stopped and stayed. A rescue line would not be enough. The mud had him too firmly. Jack and the Rangers worked quickly, laying out a tarp, testing the ground with poles, finding the one narrow angle where they might get leverage without collapsing the entire patch around him. Eli carried jugs of warm water from the truck and stacked blankets on a strip of drier grass, his hands shaking with more adrenaline than strength. They started by digging, not fast, not wildly, but in controlled movements, carving a shallow channel to let the water loosen around the calf's legs. Each scrape of the shovel sent a tremor through the mud. Twice the calf shifted and nearly lost his balance. Emily stayed in front of him the whole time, murmuring steadily, one hand raised, but not touching yet, waiting for the moment when contact might help more than it frightened. Then the first true danger showed itself. Ruth, still scanning the edges of the grass, caught movement near a rise of firmer ground. A tawny shape, low and watchful. Then another. Lions, likely drawn by distress, not yet close enough to charge, but close enough to remind everyone how thin the margin had become. The reserve officers repositioned, rifles lifted for warning only, while the work around the calf suddenly became more urgent. Jack slid the tarp under as much of the calf's chest as the mud would allow. It took all his strength and 2 Rangers pulling from the sides just to work the fabric beneath that small, failing body. The calf tried to resist once, A weak and instinctive struggle, but it barely lasted seconds. He was beyond fight now. His legs quivered violently, and his ears twitched in helpless little motions that made him look even younger. Emily saw his knees beginning to buckle and made the decision herself. She stepped closer, close enough now that she could smell the wildness on him under the mud and fear. Slowly, carefully, she laid her palm against the side of his head. He froze at the touch, not in panic, not in resistance, just stillness, total and immediate, as if some part of him had been searching for warmth all day and no longer cared what shape it came in. "Now," Jack said. The men pulled. The tarp tightened. Mud sucked greedily at the calf's legs, holding him as if it meant to keep what the storm had delivered. For one sickening second, nothing moved. Then one front leg came free with a sound like a boot torn from deep clay. The calf stumbled forward, nearly crashing down onto his face, and Emily had to brace herself to keep from falling with him. Another pull, another desperate heave. The second front leg came loose, then one hind leg, then the last. When he finally slid clear, he collapsed sideways onto the tarp in a trembling heap, ribs fluttering, trunk curled weakly against his own chest. Eli made a broken sound behind them, half relief and half disbelief. The calf was out, but he did not look saved yet. He looked borrowed. That was when the roar came. It rolled across the plain from somewhere beyond the rise, low and unmistakable, followed by the startled burst of guinea fowl lifting from the reeds. Every head turned. The lions had come nearer than anyone wanted. The rangers shouted, spread wider, engines revving from one of the reserve vehicles parked on higher ground. The noise and motion were enough. Shapes melted back into the tall grass, unwilling to challenge so many people at once. They did not waste another second. Jack and the others lifted the tarp by its corners and carried the calf toward the truck in a strained, uneven rush. He was lighter than he should have been, but still heavy enough to make their shoulders burn. His head lolled once toward Emily as she walked beside him, and for a brief moment, the tip of his trunk brushed her wrist like a question. They laid him in the back on folded blankets while the last light slid down the flooded grass and left the plain in shadow. Eli stood a few feet away, chest heaving, mud splashed to his thighs, staring as if he could not believe the same creature he had found sinking alone was now here, held up by human hands. The calf's eyes were half closed. His breathing was shallow, fast, but present. Emily climbed into the truck bed beside him before Jack had even shut the tailgate. She tucked one blanket closer around his narrow body and kept her hand where it had first rested, along the side of his head, steady and warm. Around them, the reserve team moved with the clipped efficiency that follows a narrow escape. But inside the truck, the world had quieted to one small life, and the fragile fact that it was still here. The ride back to the Morrison outpost felt longer than the drive out, though no one in the truck said much. Night had fully settled over the reserve, and the headlights cut two narrow tunnels through the dark. In the truck bed, the calf lay on a mound of blankets, too drained to protest the motion. Each bump in the road lifted his head slightly, then let it sink again into Emily's lap. She kept one hand on him the whole way, not because she knew it would save him, but because every time her palm left his skin, even for a second, he seemed to slip farther from them. His body was colder than it should have been beneath the drying mud. His breathing came fast and shallow, and once, when the truck tilted hard through a rut, he made a tiny sound that was more frail than frightened. Jack drove with the hard focus of a man trying to outrun a clock he could not see. Ruth followed behind in the Ranger vehicle for the first 10 miles, then turned back toward the flooded plain once the track grew firmer. Eli had begged to stay, but his father made him return to the station. So the little convoy broke apart in the dark, and the calf was carried south toward a place he could not yet know was meant to keep him alive. By the time they reached the outpost, the air had turned cold again. The recovery pen lights were already on, pale squares of yellow against the darkness. A sedated antelope lay under monitoring in one enclosure, and from somewhere deeper in the compound came the restless clatter of a baboon shifting in its crate. Life and injury pressed close together here. Survival was always busy, always unfinished. There was no proper stall ready for a newborn elephant, no heated wing, no neat solution waiting under fluorescent lights. Emily went straight past the storage room at first, then stopped, looked back, and changed course. It was the driest room closest to the house, lined with shelves of feed buckets, canvas rolls, spare tools, and old veterinary crates. Within seconds, she was clearing space with both arms. Jack understood without asking. He hauled out sacks of grain, folded tarps, fencing posts, and a box of cracked lantern glass, while Emily stripped the shelves of anything sharp or breakable. They worked in the frantic rhythm of people too tired to be graceful and too frightened to slow down. By the time he carried the calf in, the room had become something halfway between an emergency clinic and a child's bedroom built out of necessity. They laid him on thick straw covered with wool blankets and old horse pads. A portable heat lamp was dragged in from storage and rigged over one corner. Emily knelt at once, checking his ears, his mouth, the inside of his eyelids, the weak pulse fluttering where she could find it. Jack brought in warmed water, a first aid kit, and the metal box that held the outpost's last reserve of emergency fluids. Under the washed layers of mud, the calf looked even more fragile than he had in the field. His skin was still creased in newborn folds, his joints too prominent, his little spine sharp under her hand. There was a patch of rubbed flesh above one knee where he had fought the mud too long, and his trunk moved with clumsy uncertainty, lifting once and falling back as if he had forgotten what it was for. "He needs a name," Emily said quietly, not looking up. Jack was pouring hot water into a rubber bottle to tuck near the calf's belly. He paused, not because he disagreed, but because names carried weight. A nameless creature could still belong to the wild distance. A named one entered the house, entered the heart. He glanced toward the rain-streaked window, then back to the calf who had survived a storm, abandonment, mud, and the long, dark road. "Noah," he said. "If he made it through all that and got here, Noah fits." Emily repeated it once, soft enough that it sounded less like a decision and more like a promise. Noah. The first attempt to feed him failed almost immediately. Jack mixed a thin emergency formula from powdered nutrients, electrolytes, and warm water, while Emily steadied the bottle at the corner of his mouth. Noah turned weakly away. When a little liquid did slip in, he coughed and let it dribble back out over his chin. The effort exhausted him so quickly that Emily had to stop before he burned the rest of his strength trying. They tried warming him more first. Then small drops along the tongue. Then fluid by syringe, a little at a time. Everything felt painfully slow, measured not in progress, but in tiny refusals. Noah's body shivered beneath the blankets, then went frighteningly still, the kind of stillness that makes a room feel suddenly much too quiet. Emily checked his breathing twice in less than 10 seconds, then a third time to be sure. Near midnight, Jack stepped outside and called a wildlife specialist in Kenya who had once talked him through a difficult zebra neonatal case. The satellite connection cracked and dropped, then reconnected in fragments. They discussed calf formula ratios, temperature loss, stress response, the danger of aspiration, the signs that would mean Noah was slipping beyond what field care could reverse. Jack listened with his jaw clenched so hard it ached. Inside, Emily sat on the floor with her back against the wall and Noah's head resting against her thigh. The heat lamp cast a low amber circle around them, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. Every few minutes, she stroked the space between his eyes or ran her fingers behind his ear where the skin felt softer. She spoke to him without thinking much about the words, letting her voice do what medicine could not. He did not understand her. He could not possibly understand the little things she said about staying put, about morning coming, about no one leaving him here alone. But his breathing changed when she talked. Not stronger, not yet, but less frantic. Once, just once, his trunk lifted from the blankets and found the sleeve of her shirt, brushing it with a faint, uncertain curl before falling still again. Sometime after 1 in the morning, Jack came back in with a revised formula and a look Emily had seen before in pediatric wards and emergency rooms. A look that meant there was still a path forward, but it would be narrow. They tried again with smaller amounts and more time between swallows. Noah resisted less this time, though whether that was trust or weakness, neither of them could say. A little went in, then a little more. Not enough to feel safe, enough to keep trying. The storage room no longer looked like storage by then. It had become a place built around one tiny center of need. Towels hung from hooks to dry. Bottles stood ready in a row. A handwritten chart sat open on a crate, waiting for intake amounts and temperature checks. Beyond the thin wall, the house remained what it had always been. Quiet, practical, meant for 2 adults who had long ago stopped expecting a child's presence to rearrange the shape of their nights. But in that small pool of lamplight, with straw underfoot and blankets rising and falling under the shallow breath of a newborn elephant, something had already changed. Noah had not truly crossed into safety yet. He still hovered close to the edge, yet he was no longer lying in mud under an empty sky. He was inside. Warm hands were on him. His name had been spoken aloud. And for this one fragile night, that was enough to hold back the dark. By dawn, the outpost had fallen into that strange, fragile quiet that comes after a night no one really survives, only endures. The generators hummed softly beyond the walls. A francolin called somewhere in the gray light. In the storage room turned nursery, Noah lay under blankets with one ear folded back, his body still too thin, too weak, too close to losing its hold on the world. Emily had not slept. She sat on the floor beside him, knees drawn up, a cooling mug of tea untouched near her boot. Every hour she had checked his breathing, touched the inside of his ears, watched the rise and fall of his ribs as if looking away might let them stop. Each time his body stilled too long, her own breath seemed to stop with it. Jack came in just after sunrise, carrying a fresh bottle and a notebook filled with rough measurements from the night before. The specialist in Kenya had sent one more message through before the signal dropped. A change in ratio, a slower feeding pace, less at once, more often. It was not a miracle. It was a narrow adjustment in a long fight. But in cases like this, survival often began with something small. Noah opened his eyes when Jack set the bottle down. The movement was slight, almost uncertain, but different from the heavy, fading glances of the night before. He was still there enough to notice, still present enough to track sound. His trunk lifted weakly off the blanket and drifted through the warm air, searching without skill or aim. Then settled against Emily's leg, as though that had been where it meant to go all along. She froze at the contact, not because it hurt, but because it didn't feel accidental. Noah's trunk was still clumsy, still more guess than control, yet it lingered against her like a child's hand, finding fabric in the dark. Emily laid her palm over it gently. The skin felt warm now, rougher than it had the night before, alive in a way that made hope almost painful to hold. The next feeding started the same way the others had, slow, uncertain, one careful swallow at a time. Jack steadied the bottle while Emily kept Noah angled forward so he wouldn't aspirate. At first, he turned his head away. Then Emily spoke, not louder, just closer, the low, even tone she had once used with frightened children in hospital rooms. Noah stilled. His mouth found the nipple again. This time, he swallowed. Only a little. Only enough to make both of them stare at each other without speaking. Then another swallow followed. Then another. The room stayed so quiet around him that every tiny movement sounded enormous. The faint pull of suction, the soft click of the bottle shifting in Jack's hand, Noah's breath pausing and starting again between efforts. It was the smallest success imaginable, and it felt like sunrise. He did not finish much before tiring out, but he kept it down. That alone changed the temperature of the room. Jack wrote down the amount in the notebook, with a hand that looked steadier now. Emily touched Noah's forehead and felt something there she had not allowed herself to name before. Willingness. Not strength, not safety, not recovery. Just the first fragile sign that he had not given up. As the morning wore on, Noah's exhaustion gave way to restlessness. It was weak and uneven, but it was there. He shifted under the blankets. He let out a soft, hoarse sound when Emily stood up to rinse the bottle. She turned back at once, thinking he might be in pain. But the moment she knelt beside him again, he quieted. Jack noticed it too, though neither of them said anything at first. They tested it later without meaning to. Emily stepped into the next room to answer the radio while Jack stayed with Noah. For a minute, the calf remained still. Then his ears twitched, his trunk lifted. A thin, breathy cry slipped out of him, not loud enough to carry far, but desperate in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. When Emily returned, the sound stopped almost immediately. Jack looked at her over the top of the bottle and said what the room had already begun to understand. "He settles for you." Emily lowered herself back to the floor, and Noah turned his head toward her, as though drawn by something deeper than habit. It was too early to call it attachment, too early to trust any pattern. But she knew the look of a creature searching for one point of safety in a world that had come apart. Human child or elephant calf, that part was not so different. Need had its own language. By afternoon, Eli arrived with his father in the reserve truck, carrying fresh water, clean cloths, and a paper sack of supplies from the station. He stepped into the doorway and stopped when he saw Noah lying there in the amber light, wrapped in blankets like something both too wild and too vulnerable to be real. The calf was no longer covered in mud. He looked smaller now without it, and younger somehow. Eli knelt a few feet away, careful not to crowd him. "He's different," he whispered. "He made it through the night," Emily said. That was not the same as saying he would live. Everyone in the room knew that. But it was enough to change the air. Noah noticed the new voice and opened his eyes again. He studied Eli for a long second, not afraid exactly, just uncertain. Then his gaze slipped back to Emily, and his trunk made that same weak, searching motion over the blanket until it found the hem of her shirt. Eli saw it happen and looked down quickly, as if embarrassed by how much one small gesture could do to a person's chest. The rest of the day moved in tiny measurements, a little more formula, a cleaner breath, a warmer ear, a longer stretch without shivering. Noah was still fragile enough that every gain felt borrowed, but there was shape to the hours now, a rhythm that had not existed the day before. He no longer seemed like a creature simply fading. He seemed, in the smallest and most careful ways, to be trying. Near evening, when the light turned soft and the outpost shadows stretched long across the yard, Emily rose to wash her hands. She had barely crossed the room when Noah let out the strongest sound of the day. Not loud, but urgent, raw at the edges, the sound of something suddenly afraid of being left. She turned at once. His head was lifted. His eyes were on the doorway. His whole body had tightened around her absence. She came back before the sound had fully died. The moment she knelt beside him, Noah's trunk reached out blindly and found her wrist. This time, there was no mistaking it. He held there, barely any pressure at all, yet with unmistakable intention. Not feeding, not fear of pain. Contact, reassurance. The desperate, instinctive choice of a baby deciding, against all reason, that someone in this room belonged to him now. Emily covered his trunk gently with both hands. Jack looked away for a second, pretending to check the chart so he would not have to show what the moment had done to his face. Outside, a dove called from the fence line, and the world kept on moving through the gold of late afternoon. Inside, in that converted storage room, a line had been crossed so quietly no one could say exactly when it happened. Noah had survived the night. That was one truth. The other was softer, stranger, and somehow even more dangerous. He had begun to choose. Not the herd that had gone, not the mother who had turned away. Here, in the warmth of lamplight and worn blankets, and a woman's steady voice, the abandoned calf had started reaching toward a new center of safety. And though he did not know what to call it, the shape of it was already becoming love. Morning came clear and bright after Noah's hardest nights, and for the first time since the rescue, the outpost did not feel like a place holding its breath. The light came gently through the high storage room window, warming the straw, the folded blankets, the metal shelf where bottles now stood lined up like part of a ritual. Noah was still weak, but weakness no longer defined every second. He could stand a little longer now, though not well and never without effort. Jack would brace a hand near his shoulder while Emily coaxed him upright, and Noah would gather his legs beneath him with the solemn concentration of something learning life from the beginning. Every step looked uncertain. Every small success looked earned. When he stayed up for more than a minute, Emily smiled without realizing she had done it. Jack took over the mornings in a way that slowly became its own kind of language. He was not as soft as Emily, not as instinctively soothing, but there was steadiness in him Noah began to trust. He moved carefully, repeated things the same way, never rushed, never startled. When he came in with warm bottles and fresh water, Noah's ears would shift slightly, as if even in his exhaustion, he had begun to recognize the shape of that care. Outside the room, life at the outpost kept pressing forward. The antelope in recovery finally bore weight on its injured leg. A generator belt snapped and had to be replaced before noon. 2 rangers brought in a crate of supplies and left talking in low voices about fence damage near the eastern boundary. All of it passed around Noah like weather around a small fire. Inside the nursery, the real work stayed intimate and slow. By the end of the week, Jack began taking Noah out for a few minutes at a time. Not far. Just into the fenced yard where the morning air smelled of damp soil and sun-warmed wood. The first time, Noah stopped just beyond the threshold and froze. The open sky seemed to stir something old in him. His trunk lifted, his body tightened. For a second, Emily thought he might call out for the herd that had vanished into it. Instead, he pressed himself awkwardly against Jack's side. Jack stood still and let him. The gesture was clumsy, more collapse than cuddle, but it carried a trust that reached deeper than comfort. "Easy, buddy," he murmured, laying one hand along Noah's neck. After a few minutes, the calf relaxed enough to look around. A dove startled from the fence post. Wind moved through the mopane leaves. The world outside was large again, but this time he did not have to face it alone. Those short walks became part of the day. Jack led. Noah followed, uneven but determined, his legs strengthening by inches rather than leaps. He learned the packed dirt path first, then the rougher edge of gravel near the pump house, then the softer grass patch behind the tool shed. Jack never pulled him, only waited. And because he waited, Noah kept trying. Emily noticed other things before Jack did. Noah's different cries. For one, there was the hoarse little call that meant hunger, the breathy protest when he lost sight of her, and the low, restless sound that came when he was tired, but fighting sleep. She could tell, sometimes without looking up, when his anxiety was rising. A twitch in the ear, a pause too long at the doorway, a stiffening through the shoulders when the wind changed. One afternoon she left him for less than 5 minutes to clean syringes in the next room. Jack was with Noah the entire time. The calf had already eaten, already settled. There was no reason for trouble. Yet halfway through rinsing the sink, Emily heard the shift in the sound immediately. A thin, strained cry, not loud, but sharpened by panic. By the time she crossed back into the nursery, Noah was searching the room with wide, wet eyes. The moment he saw her, he quieted. Jack looked up from where he was kneeling by the water basin and let out a slow breath through his nose. "He knew you were gone." Emily said nothing. She only lowered herself beside Noah, and his trunk reached toward her without hesitation now, finding her sleeve, then her wrist, then the side of her knee. There was no mistaking the pattern anymore. He had not just accepted human care. He had fixed himself, heart first, to one human presence in particular, as if he had chosen a mother out of grief and need. Eli saw it too when he came on Saturday. He brought sliced melon in a dented metal bowl and stood in the yard, watching Noah trail after Jack in the sunlight. The calf was still awkward, still built more from determination than strength, but there was curiosity in him now. He stopped to investigate a fallen branch, tapped it twice with the end of his trunk, then looked up quickly when Emily called his name from the porch. He turned toward her at once. "He follows her faster than food," Eli said, almost laughing. "Don't tell Jack that," Emily replied. But Jack had heard, and for once, he didn't argue. He just leaned against the porch rail with his coffee and watched Noah make his way across the yard in that loping, uncertain little walk that somehow already felt personal. The calf had begun to memorize them. The sound of the truck door, the scrape of Emily's chair, Jack's boots on the porch steps. Home, for Noah, was becoming a collection of ordinary noises. Then the storm came back. Not as violent as the first one, but close enough to wake the memory living somewhere inside his body. Clouds stacked dark by late afternoon. The air turned metallic and close. When the first thunder rolled over the reserve, Noah jerked so hard he nearly slipped on the packed floor of the nursery. Emily was in the kitchen. Jack was outside pulling a tarp over feed sacks. The second crack of thunder broke whatever fragile calm he had built. He cried out then, truly cried out, for the first time since the rescue. It was a raw, young sound, sharp enough to cut through the house and yard at once. By the time Emily reached the nursery, Noah had backed himself into the corner and knocked a blanket crate sideways. His ears were pinned. His breathing came wild and fast. Jack rushed in behind her, but the calf's eyes were fixed only on Emily, frantic and pleading in a way that needed no translation. She dropped to the floor beside him, careless of the spilled water, the straw sticking to her jeans, the thunder still shaking the roof. Noah lunged forward awkwardly and pressed the full weight of his head against her chest. Not because she could protect him from weather, not because she could change what had happened on that soaked, terrible morning, but because some part of him now believed that if he could reach her in time, he would not be abandoned again. Emily wrapped both arms around him as best she could and let him shake. The storm passed within an hour. The thunder moved east. Rain ticked briefly against the corrugated roof, then softened into dripping silence. Noah did not lift his head right away. He stayed folded against her, his breathing gradually slowing until it matched the pace of her own. Jack righted the crate, reset the lamp, and said very little. Some truths arrived without needing to be spoken aloud. That evening, after Noah had finally settled, Jack stood out by the fence line with Eli and watched the lights glow warm through the nursery window. "He's stronger," Eli said. Jack nodded, but his eyes stayed on the house. "Yeah," he said after a moment, "and now we know what still lives in him." Inside, Noah slept with one ear resting over Emily's boot. The fear had not vanished. The memory of rain and mud and a retreating herd had not left him. But something new stood beside that memory now, something steady enough to meet it. He had learned the shape of safety. He had learned where to run when the sky turned dark. And without knowing it, he had carried the story into its next turning point. He was no longer only surviving this family. He was beginning to belong to it. By the third month, Noah no longer looked like a creature rescued from the edge of a storm. He had filled out through the shoulders and along the ribs, though he was still small for his age, still marked by a difficult beginning in the way some children carry old illness in their bones. His skin had lost that paper-thin newborn look. His eyes, once dulled by exhaustion, now followed everything. The outpost had changed with him. What began as emergency care had settled into a life with patterns, and those patterns bent around Noah without anyone needing to say so. Jack checked fencing and feed stores with a young elephant trailing at his heel. Emily read reports on the porch, with Noah dozing beside her chair, his trunk occasionally reaching for the edge of her shirt just to make sure she was still there. He had grown bolder in small, meaningful ways. He knew where the water trough stood and how to bump it when he wanted a refill. He had learned that Jack sometimes hid pieces of apple in his shirt pocket, and that Eli, when he visited, always smuggled in something soft and sweet from the kitchen. He had learned the sound of evening before dark, the scrape of boots, the clink of mugs, the quiet human signals that said the day was winding down safely. But health was only one part of what needed rebuilding. The reserve network had begun asking the question everyone knew would come. Noah was an elephant calf, not a domestic animal, not a permanent patient, not a creature meant to be shaped only by human hands. If he was going to have any future beyond survival, he would need to learn from his own kind. He would need elephants. Jack did not avoid the conversation, but he did not hurry it either. He knew too well what fear could harden into if handled badly. So did Emily. Noah had come back from the body of starvation, shock, and exposure. But the deeper wound in him had always been attachment, where it broke, where it reformed, and what happened when the thing he trusted disappeared. Any next step would have to honor that. The first introductions happened in a managed section of the reserve, 2 miles from the outpost, where a small group of semi-wild females sometimes passed through on known routes. Noah did not know it yet, but one of them had already become a point of interest to the rangers. Her name was Maya, an older female with a slow, measured gait and the steady confidence of an elephant who had seen both drought and loss. Noah saw the group from behind the safety of a reinforced barrier and froze. His trunk lifted high, tasting the air. Every line of his body changed. It was not fear exactly, though fear moved through it. It was recognition too old to be taught and too deep to be reasoned with. Stepped backward until he touched Emily's leg, then stayed there, half hidden against her, while the elephants beyond the fence shifted and watched. Maya was the only one who came closer. She did not rush the barrier or crowd the calf with authority. She simply stopped a few yards away and stood there, calm as weather, her eyes on Noah. After a long moment, she extended her trunk through the gap between the rails as far as it would go. Noah hesitated, every instinct in him torn between approach and retreat. Then, with Emily's hand resting lightly at his shoulder, he stepped forward and reached back. The contact lasted only a second. It was enough to change the room inside, everyone watching. Noah drew back immediately after, but not in panic, in thought. He stayed near Emily, yet he did not look only at her now. He looked at Maya too, as if something ancient and unfinished had just been spoken to in a language older than his grief. When the little group moved off, he watched until the last gray shape disappeared between the mopane trunks. That night, he was restless. He did not cry, but he would not settle either. He paced his small sleeping area, circled back to the porch, pressed his trunk against the screen door, then returned to his blankets only to rise again minutes later. Emily sat with him until midnight. Jack took the hours after that. Neither said it aloud, but both understood what had been stirred. Noah had seen a door open, and now he did not know whether he was meant to walk through it. The outpost tried carefully, then more deliberately. A little more time near the elephant group. A little less direct comfort the moment Noah hesitated. Space for him to explore, retreat, and return. He began learning things humans could never really teach him: how to read stillness in another elephant's body, how to mirror a slow shift in weight, how to pause before moving closer instead of barging with calfish uncertainty. Maya accepted him in increments. And yet every afternoon, Noah came home as if pulled by an invisible line. He would spend the day in the reserve enclosure, following at a distance, trying awkward dust baths, testing branches with his trunk, standing too close to the younger elephants, and then jumping back when corrected. But once the sun dipped lower and the light softened gold, he turned toward the outpost without needing to be called. He knew the path. He knew the yard. He knew exactly which porch step Emily favored in the evening. The final proof came in the worst way possible. Emily got sick at the start of the rainy week, not dramatically at first, just the kind of deep, dragging illness that begins in the chest and steals strength by degrees. By the second day, she had a fever. By the third, she was in bed behind a closed screen door, ordered to rest by the same reserve medic she usually argued with. Noah did not understand the absence. He only understood that she had vanished. He refused the yard that morning, refused the feed bucket, refused even Jack's calm coaxing toward the truck. Instead, he stationed himself outside Emily's room. He stood there through the heat of the afternoon and into the cooler edge of evening, his body angled toward the door, his trunk sometimes resting against the lower frame, sometimes slipping carefully through the small open gap near the corner. When she coughed from inside, his ears lifted at once. When all went quiet, he leaned in farther, searching. Once, late that night, Jack found him sleeping upright against the doorway, like a sentry too devoted to lie down. For 3 days, Noah kept watch. He ate only when Jack brought food directly to him. He would not go to the reserve enclosure. He would not follow Maya when the group passed nearby. He had made a decision in the unarguable way young creatures do when love and fear become the same instinct. He was staying with his mother until she came back out. When Emily finally opened the door and stepped into the weak afternoon light, Noah went still all over, not startled, not wild, just stunned in that deep, quiet way that belongs to relief too large for sound. Then he moved toward her, slow at first, then faster, until he stood close enough to inspect her with the full length of his trunk. Her hands, her arms, the front of her shirt, her face. Only after that did he press his forehead gently against her body and stand there, eyes half closed, as if verifying what his heart had refused to stop believing. Jack turned away for a second and rubbed his mouth with one hand. Eli, who had come by with soup and extra medicine, said nothing at all. Even the reserve medic, usually brisk to the point of rudeness, looked at the ground and let the moment belong to itself. After that, the argument about Noah's future changed shape. No one spoke anymore about forcing a full separation. It would have been easy, on paper, to say he belonged only with elephants now that he was stronger. It would have sounded cleaner, more proper, more professional. But life rarely obeyed the clean version of a story. Noah had survived because he had attached. He had healed because he had chosen. To tear that bond apart in the name of purity would not have restored him. It would have broken him twice. So they built another way. Noah would spend his days with the reserve elephants, especially under Maya's patient eye, learning the language of his own kind. He would return to the outpost in the evenings. He would grow between worlds instead of being ripped from one and thrown wholly into the other. It was not textbook, it was not tidy, but it was merciful, and mercy had carried him this far. Weeks later, when the light turned honey-colored at the edge of dusk, Noah stood at the path between the reserve enclosure and the Morrison yard. Behind him, Maya waited in still composure, her great shape half lit by the falling sun. Ahead, Jack was fixing a loose latch near the water trough. Eli sat on the steps shelling peanuts into a tin cup. Emily stood by the fence, one hand resting on the rail, watching. Noah looked back once toward the elephants. Then he turned and walked home, not with panic, not in confusion, with the calm certainty of something that knew exactly where it belonged. He crossed the yard, went straight to Emily, and lifted his trunk to her shoulder in that now familiar gesture that was neither wild nor tame, but something in between, something chosen. Behind him, Maya remained where she was, not abandoned, not replaced, simply part of a larger world Noah could now move through without losing himself. He had been left in the mud by the mother who gave him life, but he had become someone else's baby by the people who gave him a reason to keep living. And in the end, that was not a lesser kind of family. It was the family he had found, the family he had chosen, and the family that had chosen him back. If Noah's story touched your heart, leave a 1 in the comments. And if you believe no baby should ever be left behind, comment heart. Your comment helps more people find stories like this, and it lets us know you were here with Noah all the way to the end. Please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us for the next story. Because some of the most powerful true bonds are still waiting to be told.